Hello, friends. Pastor Chester Hitchcock here of the Gospel Memory Course with part two of the genealogy of Jesus. In my last lesson in part one, I explained how the genealogies recorded in Matthew and Luke differ greatly and gave some possible explanations as to why that is so. Today, I just want to point out some of the names, and certainly with verse 2, it talks about Abraham. Now, we're all familiar with Abraham. Abraham, however, keep in mind that when God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees from his father's land, he was called Abram at that time, and he was a pagan. He had been raised by a pagan father. And in fact, that when Abram had God changed his name to Abraham, he actually lied about his wife Sarah being his sister twice to save his own skin in Genesis chapter 12 and in Genesis chapter 20. Also, we find in the story of Abraham and Sarah that Abraham has a child by his wife's handmaiden. Now, in that culture, they wanted a son so bad that it was Abraham's wife Sarah who suggested it, but nonetheless, Abraham agreed to it rather than having faith in God. If you haven't read the story, you really owe it to yourself to see that. But Abraham agrees to that, and the world has been in turmoil ever since, because you have Isaac, which is God's promised son, and then you have Ishmael, which was Hagar's son by Abraham. Then in verse 2, you also have the name Jacob that is mentioned. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Jacob and Esau, the name Jacob means supplanter or deceiver. He cheated his brother Esau out of the birthright because Esau, though they were twins, Esau was actually the oldest, and Jacob cheated him by lying to his father and convincing him that he was the firstborn, because his father was blind and was deceived. In verse 3 of Matthew, we find the name Judah mentioned. Now, Judah, if you remember in the story of Judah, he has a Canaanite wife who they have two sons, Ur and Onan, and Ur was an evil and wicked man, and so God killed him. And Ur's wife Tamar then was without child, and so in those days it was the expectation of the brother to have a child by her to raise up for his brother, and Onan refused to do that. Tamar wanted a son so bad that she concealed herself actually as a harlot, and Judah, in his time of depression and sadness, went to her as a harlot. I mean, what is wrong with this story? And she ends up getting pregnant when he comes to find out that she is with his child. Then later he marries Tamar. But what a messed up story that is. But also keep in mind that Judah actually was one of the brothers of Joseph that participated in throwing Joseph into a pit, selling him off into slavery into Egypt, and lying to his father, saying that Joseph had actually been killed by a wild animal. That's some of Judah's history. And then in verse 5, it talks about Salmon. Now, I do want to read verse 5 and verse 6 with you, but just verse 5 right now says, Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, and Obed begot Jesse. Now let's stop here for a minute. Who was Rahab? Well, one time Rahab was a heathen harlot who lived on the wall of Jericho, that when the 12 spies went to spy in Canaan, she rescued a couple of the spies, and church history believes that she married one of the spies. But Rahab, along with Tamar, is one of 4 of the foreign women who are ancestresses of our Lord Jesus. I mean, again, the first one is Tamar, then there is Rahab, and then there's Ruth, who was the third one that was mentioned. And then Bathsheba, which gets us to verse 6. So look at verse 6. And then Jesse begot David the king, and David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Who was that? Bathsheba. And do you know the story of Bathsheba? First of all, let's get the idea of the picture of David. David was a man after God's own heart. He was the youngest of the sons of Jesse. He's the one who killed Goliath by knocking him down with a rock and then going over and taking Goliath's sword and cutting his head off. However, when David was king and he was walking around on the rooftop of the palace, he spots Bathsheba bathing below. He goes and has an affair with her, and when she comes to be pregnant, he sends Uriah, her son, her husband, who was already in battle, he put him in a place of battle where he would be killed. So David not only has an affair with a married woman, but he has her husband killed. And the son that was born as a result of that union died. But they went on to get married and had a son later that they named Solomon. And Jesus descended from Solomon. When you look at this family tree, one might ask, why didn't Jesus just descend through the lineage of Joseph? Because there's no mention in the Bible of Joseph ever doing anything wrong. Not that he was sinless, but there's no mention of anything wrong done by Joseph. Why didn't Jesus descend through Joseph? Instead, he descends through Judah, and he has all of these problematic people recorded in his ancestry. So if at times you feel like that you don't have a good family tree, or you feel like that you might be the bad fruit in your family tree, there is hope. Jesus can relate. Jesus can relate to broken families. Jesus came into a broken and confused family lineage. He was born in a manger instead of in a castle. Jesus can relate to us. So if you ever feel held back because of the side of the tracks that you came from, or even your culture or background, you can find hope in the genealogy of Jesus. If you find this video helpful, click on like, give it a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed yet, then click on subscribe and ring that bell so that you can be sure to get a notification the next time I make a video. The next one will be about the longest genealogy in the Bible, found in 1 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. 9 chapters of names that are difficult to pronounce. Don't worry, I'm not going to read them to you, but I do want to make a few points about this longest genealogy. God bless, and happy memories.